No one in Washington expected it to be said out loud, at least not with that level of blunt force. These are the kinds of things people whisper in hallways, hint at on cable panels, or bury inside vague legal language. But Eric Swalwell didn't whisper. He didn't hint. He didn't soften a single word. He looked straight across the room, fixed his gaze on Kash Patel, and spoke the name everyone else had been carefully dancing around for years, Trump, and then he tied that name directly to the Epstein files and demanded an explanation. That single moment changed the tone of the entire hearing. If you watch Patel's face when the question lands, you can see exactly when control starts slipping. That expression explains everything that follows. And if this is your first time here, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on, because this story didn't end in that room, and it's not ending tonight. What happened next set off a chain reaction that's still unfolding. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to understand the setup. This meeting was originally scheduled as a closed-door Senate Intelligence Committee session. No cameras, no public transcript, no viral clips. At the last minute, Swalwell formally requested it be converted into an open hearing. He argued that the public deserved to see what was about to take place. That request alone should have raised alarms. Closed sessions don't suddenly become public unless someone knows fireworks are coming. Now we know exactly why. Kash Patel entered the room the way he always does, projecting calm authority. His shoulders were back, his chin slightly raised. 3 attorneys flanked him, with 2 aides trailing just behind. It was the posture of someone who believes he's survived worse. He's testified countless times. He knows how these rooms work. He knows how to deflect, how to stall, how to answer without answering. He knows how to run out the clock. What he didn't account for was someone willing to ignore the unwritten rules. The first 40 minutes unfolded exactly as expected. Budget allocations, counterterrorism updates, routine questions about surveillance, oversight, and intelligence priorities. Patel handled it smoothly, offering familiar, carefully worded responses that revealed very little. He checked his watch more than once. At times, he looked bored. It was clear he thought this would be another standard appearance, another day where nothing truly uncomfortable would surface. Then Swalwell took the microphone. His tone was calm, almost casual. "Director Patel, I want to talk about the Epstein files." Patel's expression barely moved. He'd heard versions of this before. He had prepared answers ready, lines he'd delivered in past testimony. He started to respond automatically. "Of course, Senator, as I've stated previously," Swalwell cut him off without raising his voice. "I'm not interested in your previous testimony." That interruption landed harder than shouting would have. Swalwell opened a thick red folder, its edges marked with colored tabs. The kind of folder that signals preparation, not improvisation. "I'm interested in what you haven't told us." The room changed instantly. There's a specific kind of silence that descends when everyone realizes a line has been crossed. This wasn't normal quiet. It was the kind of stillness where you can feel attention lock in from every corner. Swalwell didn't rush. He continued deliberately. He said he wanted to know why every Epstein-related document that mentioned Donald Trump had been reclassified since Patel became FBI director. Not some of them, not most of them, all of them. The room didn't just fall quiet, it froze. People stopped moving. You could almost feel the oxygen disappear. Patel's face flickered through a series of reactions in seconds. Surprise, irritation, then the reset. The familiar, controlled expression officials wear when they know cameras are watching. He responded carefully, claiming he had no knowledge of any reclassification targeting documents tied to any specific individual. "No knowledge," he said. Swalwell didn't pause. He reached into the folder and pulled out a document. He identified it clearly. An internal FBI memorandum dated March 15th of this year, just 3 months after Patel assumed his role. The memo instructed the Classification Review Board to fast-track a review of all Epstein-related materials referencing current government officials or individuals connected to them. Swalwell held the document up long enough for the cameras to catch it. He pointed out the signature at the bottom. It belonged to Patel's deputy director. Then he asked the question that mattered. Was Patel seriously telling the committee he knew nothing about it? Patel's eyes flicked briefly toward his attorneys. They didn't move. No notes. No whispered guidance. This wasn't something they could step in to fix. Patel tried to retreat into procedure, explaining that classification reviews happen regularly as part of standard operations. Swalwell shut that down immediately. His voice sharpened, still controlled, but carrying unmistakable pressure. He explained that since Patel took office, 23 documents that had already been approved for public release were pulled back and reclassified. 23, and every single one referenced Donald Trump. Swalwell leaned forward and made the point impossible to ignore. That wasn't coincidence. That was a pattern. In that moment, the hearing stopped being routine oversight and became something else entirely. And this was only the beginning. This is where the exchange crossed from uncomfortable into explosive. Patel tried to pivot, the way seasoned officials often do when a line of questioning turns dangerous. He attempted to reframe the moment as political theater, suggesting Swalwell was engaging in partisan attacks rather than legitimate oversight. He expressed disappointment that members of the committee would pursue what he called politically motivated narratives. The word hung in the air for half a second before Swalwell reacted. He laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was sharp, controlled, and edged with disbelief. He made it clear that he wasn't the one who reclassified documents. He wasn't the one who buried information. He wasn't the one who swore an oath to uphold the law and then selectively decided which facts the public could see. He told Patel plainly that the responsibility sat squarely with him. As he spoke, you could feel frustration hardening into anger, not recklessness, but the kind that comes from watching something avoided for too long. Swalwell pressed further, asking whether Patel even understood what was contained inside those documents. He asked whether Patel grasped what the public would learn if those files were released. Patel locked his jaw and refused to engage, stating that he would not speculate on classified material. That answer only poured fuel on the fire. Swalwell didn't speculate either. He reached for another paper and explained exactly what it was. An unclassified summary of witness testimony from 2019. The testimony came from a woman who worked at Epstein's Palm Beach residence. According to Swalwell, she provided 14 names, 14 men she personally saw at the property with underage girls. Swalwell didn't break eye contact as he delivered the line that changed the room. One of those names, he said, was Donald Trump. The reaction was immediate and visible. There wasn't shouting or applause, but there were gasps that cut through the silence. Reporters leaned forward, phones already in motion. Senators exchanged looks that ranged from shock to something that looked a lot like relief, as if a thought too dangerous to voice had finally been spoken aloud. Patel tried to interrupt, insisting that the testimony had been fully reviewed. Swalwell cut him off mid-sentence. He asked what happened after that review. Was it stamped, classified, locked away, and removed from public view? Then something rare happened. Swalwell stood up, not figuratively. He actually rose from his chair in the middle of the hearing. It was a striking visual, one that signaled this was no longer a routine exchange. He reminded the room that the FBI had possessed that testimony for 6 years. 6 years to investigate, 6 years to follow leads, 6 years to do what the public expects federal law enforcement to do. Instead, he argued, the response had been to reclassify the material. He pointed directly at Patel and said, the reclassification wasn't about protecting national security. It was about protecting Donald Trump. He said everyone in the room knew it. That accusation didn't feel rhetorical. It felt deliberate. This was the moment that would be replayed over and over by nightfall. Swalwell then held up a large color photograph, making sure the cameras had a clear view. He asked Patel if he recognized it. It was the now famous image of Trump and Epstein together at Mar-a-Lago in 1997, both smiling, both appearing comfortable in each other's presence. Swalwell noted that the photo had been public for years. Everyone had seen it. What the public hadn't seen, he said, were the 37 additional photographs taken at the same event. According to Swalwell, those images were logged as evidence and stored inside FBI facilities. Images that Patel's office had declined to release. Swalwell placed the photograph flat on the desk and asked a direct question. What was in those pictures, and why were they still hidden? At this point, Patel was visibly sweating, not metaphorically. Actual beads of sweat formed along his forehead under the bright hearing room lights. He attempted to explain that releasing evidentiary photographs involved complex considerations, including privacy issues and potential investigative concerns. Swalwell slammed his hand onto the desk, jolting the microphone. He said there was no ongoing investigation. Epstein was dead. Maxwell was serving her sentence. That chapter was closed. According to Swalwell, the only reason to keep those images classified was because someone powerful didn't want them seen. He locked eyes with Patel and said they both knew exactly who that person was. Then Swalwell paused. He addressed the viewers directly, urging them to like the video and engage, not for personal gain but to ensure the conversation reached more people. He emphasized that this wasn't a moment that should fade quietly, and then came the silence. 20 full seconds passed without a word. In a congressional hearing, that's an eternity. It was the kind of silence that tells you a witness has run out of prepared answers. Patel sat motionless. His attorneys stayed silent. The talking points he brought with him had collapsed under direct confrontation. When he finally spoke again, his tone was different, lower, and guarded. He rejected the suggestion that the FBI acted to protect anyone, insisting all classification decisions were based strictly on legitimate law enforcement and national security concerns. Swalwell didn't let that answer stand unchallenged. He shook his head slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of what he had just laid out sink in. He outlined what he saw, piece by piece, painting a picture that left little room for ambiguity. In his view, Patel wasn't just any FBI director. He was an appointee of Donald Trump. His career had been shaped, elevated, and secured by Trump's influence. And over the past 11 months, according to Swalwell, that same director had systematically concealed evidence linking Trump to a convicted sex trafficker. Swalwell emphasized that what was happening inside the FBI wasn't law enforcement in the traditional sense. It wasn't about justice or accountability, it was obstruction. The word hung in the air, precise and damning. He promised the American people that the committee would pursue the truth, even if it meant personally subpoenaing every document in the building. Technically, the hearing continued after that. Other senators asked questions covering cybersecurity, foreign interference, and procedural matters. On paper, it looked like the session carried on as normal. But the truth was, no one was really listening anymore. The echo of Swalwell's accusation filled the room and dominated every conversation. Every line of questioning after that became background noise compared to what had just been declared on record. Donald Trump's name appeared repeatedly in the Epstein files, and Patel's handling of those documents was now a matter of public record. Within minutes, footage of the hearing went viral. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, and cable news networks all replayed the exchange, cutting into live programming. Legal analysts debated whether Patel's testimony crossed the line into obstruction of justice. Somewhere inside the FBI, staffers were undoubtedly scrambling, trying to prepare for questions they had never anticipated being asked in public. The stakes of this hearing mattered because they moved speculation into the realm of evidence. For years, the public had debated what was contained in the Epstein files. There were conspiracy theories, online deep dives on Reddit, and endless late-night discussions. But speculation, as Swalwell showed, is fundamentally different from evidence. He presented documents, internal memos, and witness testimony that directly named individuals. And one name, again and again, seemed to orbit around the most sensitive files: Donald Trump. Let me be clear, Swalwell wasn't asserting guilt or innocence. That wasn't his role. His role, and ours as viewers, was to observe what actually happened inside that hearing room. The facts were simple. A sitting U.S. senator presented evidence suggesting that the FBI had actively shielded a former president from material linking him to Jeffrey Epstein. The gravity of that moment can't be overstated. Swalwell's next moves built pressure that can't easily be erased. He announced that the committee would move to subpoena all 23 documents that had been reclassified. He demanded a closed-door briefing with the Classification Review Board and called for an Inspector General investigation into Patel's handling of Epstein-related evidence. Whether any of that will actually move forward in Washington is uncertain. The city is adept at making controversies disappear, letting attention drift, and burying memories under new headlines. But this particular moment isn't going anywhere. The footage won't vanish. The photograph of Trump and Epstein will continue to circulate, and the question that Swalwell asked, "What are you hiding?" remains unresolved. Patel now faces direct accountability. He must explain why 23 documents were pulled back. He must justify why every single one involved Trump. He must face the American public and insist convincingly that this was nothing more than coincidence. Even after all this, the drama of the hearing wasn't over. The scene replayed in countless minds, Swalwell rising from his chair, pointing directly at Patel, speaking aloud what had long been suspected but never formally stated in a public record. "You protected Donald Trump," he said. "The accusation was precise, undeniable, and not open to interpretation. And the significance is clear. Accusations of this nature do not vanish. They linger, demanding scrutiny. They create pressure that builds, slowly at first, then relentlessly, until the wall of secrecy begins to crack. Something is shifting. The protective barrier around these files, carefully maintained by Patel, was hit with a sledgehammer by one determined senator in just 3 minutes. This was the moment when theory became reality. The connection between Trump and the Epstein files was no longer speculation. It had entered the congressional record. Patel sat under the bright lights, sweating visibly, with no defense left and nowhere to hide. The implications are enormous. One hearing, one document, one senator, willing to speak the uncomfortable truth at a critical moment. These are the pieces that slowly uncover what was once hidden. And as viewers, there is only one way to stay ahead of the story. Follow the developments closely, subscribe, and watch as the truth unfolds, piece by piece, document by document. As the dust from that confrontation settled, it became clear that the hearing had already crossed a point of no return. Even though Patel remained seated and composed himself, the damage had been done in full view of the public. Accusations like the ones Swalwell delivered don't dissolve once the microphones are turned off. They linger, especially when they're backed by documents, dates, and signatures. The image of Patel sitting under the lights, struggling to maintain control as the narrative slipped from his grasp, became the lasting visual of the day. It was no longer about how confidently he entered the room or how many hearings he had survived before. This one followed different rules, because this time the accusation had been made clearly, directly, and on the record. What made the moment even heavier was how quickly it spread beyond the walls of Congress. Within minutes, clips of the exchange were circulating across every major platform. Analysts paused live broadcasts to dissect Patel's wording. Former prosecutors debated whether his testimony exposed him to legal risk. Commentators who had previously avoided the Epstein topic now addressed it openly, because they had no choice. A sitting senator had laid out evidence that demanded attention. And while Washington is known for short attention spans, this wasn't something easily replaced by the next headline. The public reaction wasn't driven by shock alone, but by the clarity of what had been presented. For the first time, viewers weren't being asked to connect dots on their own. The dots were already connected. Behind the scenes, the consequences were likely immediate. Inside the FBI, staffers would have been forced into emergency discussions, preparing explanations for actions that had never been expected to face public scrutiny. Classification boards don't like sunlight. Internal memos aren't written with viral clips in mind. The realization that these decisions were now being questioned openly would have sent a ripple of unease through the agency. Even if Patel maintained that everything was done by the book, the perception of selective secrecy had already taken hold. And perception, in moments like this, carries almost as much weight as proof. Swalwell's strategy became clearer as the hours passed. He wasn't trying to win an argument in the room. He was putting pressure on the system itself. By naming names, citing dates, and presenting documents, he forced other institutions to respond. Subpoenas, inspector general reviews, and classification audits don't happen quietly. They create paper trails. They involve multiple offices. They invite leaks. Even if some efforts stall, others move forward. And every step increases the risk that more information becomes public. This is how walls come down in Washington, not all at once, but piece by piece. What unsettled many observers was how little Patel could say in response without making things worse. Denials sounded rehearsed, explanations leaned heavily on procedure, and silence, especially those long seconds when no answer came at all, spoke louder than words. It's in those gaps that audiences draw their own conclusions, and once those conclusions take hold, reversing them becomes nearly impossible. Patel wasn't just defending decisions anymore. He was defending credibility, and that is far harder to recover. The broader implication extended well beyond Patel himself. The question now facing the public wasn't just what was inside the Epstein files, but who decides what the public is allowed to know. Classification, by design, is meant to protect national security, not reputations. When that line appears blurred, trust erodes quickly. Swalwell's accusation cuts straight to that concern. If evidence exists that connects powerful figures to serious crimes, the public expects transparency, not silence. And once that expectation is broken, skepticism fills the gap. By the end of the day, one thing was undeniable. The Epstein files were no longer a fringe topic discussed in corners of the internet. They were central to a formal congressional dispute involving the FBI and a former president. That shift alone marked a turning point. Even if nothing moved immediately, the pressure had been applied, and pressure has a way of finding weak points. The system could attempt to absorb the impact, but the fracture was already visible, and fractures, once exposed, rarely seal themselves. The final act of this confrontation was a culmination of months, even years, of speculation suddenly transformed into documented reality. Swalwell's closing moves made it clear that this wasn't about political theater or fleeting headlines. It was about accountability. He reminded everyone in the room and every viewer watching from home that the chain of evidence, the documents, the witness statements, and the photographs all pointed to the same uncomfortable truth. These files were being handled in a way that shielded one individual. He didn't embellish, he didn't exaggerate, he presented fact after fact, document after document, forcing Patel into a corner where no procedural dodge could rescue him. The weight of the evidence pressed down visibly, and it was impossible to ignore. Even as the hearing technically continued with other senators asking about cybersecurity and foreign interference, no one in the room could look past what had just been laid bare. The tension from those moments, the photographs, the reclassified documents, the witness testimony dominated every conversation. The echoes of Swalwell's questions filled the room and set a new baseline for what public scrutiny could demand. For the first time, the conversation shifted from rumor to record. The American people could now see, on camera, that the issue wasn't abstract. It wasn't conjecture. It was a tangible, on-the-record confrontation that directly implicated actions taken by the FBI in relation to a former president. Swalwell's insistence on transparency didn't stop with verbal questions. He demanded subpoenas for the 23 documents that had been reclassified, insisting on a closed-door briefing with the Classification Review Board. He called for an inspector general review of how Patel had handled Epstein-related evidence. These actions were not just procedural, they were a deliberate effort to create accountability. Washington has a way of quietly moving on, letting attention drift, and smothering controversies under new stories. But the visibility of this moment, captured on camera and disseminated instantly across social media, ensures it cannot simply vanish. The images, the testimony, the pointed questions, they're indelibly part of the public record. What made this moment historic wasn't only the documents or the photographs, it was Swalwell himself. In just 3 minutes, he forced an FBI director to confront questions no one else would ask publicly. He named names. He tied actions directly to decisions. He challenged the narrative that has long protected powerful individuals from scrutiny, and in doing so, he turned speculation into evidence, rumor into congressional record. Patel sat there under the lights, sweating, with no answer, nowhere to hide. The truth, slowly but steadily, was coming out. Even after the cameras stopped rolling, the implications remained. Every reclassified document, every withheld photograph, every testimony buried in an office now had a new context. The question at the heart of the matter, "What are you hiding?" wasn't rhetorical anymore. It was a legal, ethical, and public challenge demanding an answer. The wall that Patel had built around the Epstein files was cracking. Swalwell had struck it with precision, exposing the tension between law enforcement, public accountability, and political influence. And while the full outcome remains to be seen, the moment itself was permanent. For viewers, The takeaway is simple but profound. One senator, armed with facts and courage, can shift the conversation from whispers to undeniable reality. Each hearing, each document, and each photo adds another piece to the puzzle. The story of the Epstein files and their connection to powerful figures is now documented, traceable, and undeniable. The next chapters will unfold, but the precedent has been set. Transparency, accountability, and public oversight have been demanded in the most undeniable way possible. This isn't speculation anymore, it's history being recorded, one hearing at a time. The public has a front row seat, and the questions raised are now impossible to ignore.